I have a letter that was one of my favorite letters that I received during the publication of this book. And it was a request from a middle schooler, so I'll read it to you and try and answer some of her questions. Dear Miss Mona Simpson, I am a student at William Wirt Middle School. Currently, I am investigating careers to learn which would be the best for me. I am very interested in the writing author profession, and I would appreciate it if you could answer the following questions by tomorrow. Thanks in advance. And in fact, I did quickly, dash off some answers to her, but I thought I would give you what would be the more serious answers to her questions. Her questions were actually pretty great. Number one was, were you a good student? Number two was, how do you get the ideas for your books? Number three is, are your books true stories? Number four is, why do you write them? And number five is, do you make a lot of money? And number six is, are you famous? Number seven is, who helped you get where you are? I can dispatch with some of them very quickly. Were you a good student? Not particularly. It's a funny thing about being a writer. It doesn't, I sometimes teach lightly at UCLA, and I want to tell my students, you can stop the grade grubbing now. If you really want to be writers, it doesn't matter at all. How do you get your ideas for your books? Well, this book, Case Book, I got the idea, I wanted to write, someone I respected said, the thing you haven't done is you haven't written a love story. And I wanted to write a love story. I think so much of the time we want to write a kind of book that we would like to read. And so many of the books I've gotten great pleasure from have great love stories in them. War and Peace, all of the Jane Austen books, George Eliot's Middlemarch. So many of my favorite books are love stories. So I set about to try and write an adult contemporary love story. We're generations away now from arranged marriages. Many of the strictures in many of those books I mentioned aren't problems anymore for us. Since 1964, there's been birth control. Even the Catholic Church allows some forms of annulments. It's a different trajectory for us now. And so I wanted to explore what in our time is romantic love. Is it a good idea? Are there better ways to form a marriage? What are the problems of romantic love? What are the problems of trying to get by without it? Now that was sort of an idea for a novel. And that's exactly what it was. It was kind of an idea. And I worked on it for a while and got really nowhere. Because ideas are wonderful, but they aren't really novels. Novels are much more in the sticky stuff of life. They're sort of in the deep personal, not necessarily my personal, but they exist somewhere else. So eventually I got the voice of a boy who was spying on his parents and witnessing their adult love lives. And that was what made it possible for me to write this novel. And I liked that because it also kind of reverberated. It was not just about the lovers and would they succeed or fail and would their love work, but it was about another character, a member of the family, who cared deeply about whether this new love in one of his parents' life would help the family, maybe, help it become stable and financially secure, whether it would endanger them, whether it would break his parents' heart. So that kind of worked for me. Are your books true stories? That's a hard one. You hope they're true stories, but that's a completely different thing from being something that actually happened. I think in several of my books I've used elements of what you might say is kind of the plot of my life. Especially when you publish a first novel, everyone wants to know, is that your mother? Is that your grandfather? My first book was about a mother and a daughter leaving a small town in the Midwest and coming to LA. That was true for my life. That's what I took from my life and made into that novel. Most of the rest of it is, I hope, truer than what actually happened to me. Sometimes I say that novel is kind of the PG version of life in some ways. Why do I write novels? That's a great question. It's funny that you mentioned, Peggy, in that great introduction, that I had chosen between medicine and writing. I don't know how you came up with that. But I think one of the reasons I write is I grew up with I had a single mother with whom I grew up alone, the two of us. We were very close. And she was mentally ill, and so she had a large element of fantasy in her life. And it was hard to know exactly what was true. So two things sort of went on at the time where I was becoming a writer. I was going to Berkeley. I was leaving LA to go up to Berkeley. And my mother became very depressed, and she sort of made veiled allusions to killing herself. She said, maybe when I drive you up to Berkeley on the way back, I'll drive over the cliffs. I didn't think she meant it, but I wasn't sure. Of course, at the time, what didn't occur to me is, you grew up with one person. We were incredibly close, and I was leaving. So she'd lived with me as long as she'd lived with anyone in her life. She lived with her parents for 18 years, and she lived with me for 18 years. She was married to my father briefly. He was out of our lives for the most part. And so that was going on. And then the other thing that was going on is my mother had a kind of, once when she was in Syria, when I was not yet born, and she was pregnant with me, my grandfather, who was a wealthy man in Syria, had apparently said, you don't have to worry about your children. I will send them to college. 18 years later, working as a speech therapist in the Los Angeles public schools, she imagined that somehow my Syrian grandfather, who was by then dead, unbeknownst to her, would have found us and sent the UC Regents a check for my college tuition. So I got to Berkeley, and there was a problem. I hadn't applied for financial aid. At that time, I looked in the phone book. I was taking chemistry. I thought I wanted to be a doctor, and I was also taking literature classes. I knew I wanted to be a writer. And I found I went in the phone book in Los Angeles where I lived and found the number for a psychiatrist near where I lived. And I called and made an appointment, and I rode my bike there, and I went and said, I'm worried about my mother. I think she's going to kill herself. He said, she won't. Go, continue your studies. He couldn't have possibly known that, but luckily he was right. I said, I think I want to be a doctor or a writer. How do I decide? And he said, you want to be a writer, you want to be a doctor. I think you want to be a doctor to save your mother. If you love writing, go back and be a writer. Question number 5 of Savannah from William Wirt Middle School. Do you make a lot of money? No. This is a problem. But it's wonderful to be with, I think nobody goes into becoming a writer at this time. It's probably a lot like those who go to medical school now after Obamacare. Nobody's in it now to make the big paycheck. So in a way, it's kind of nice because we're all in it for the right reasons. We're all going to, in some way or another, be doing something else or doing a lot of work to peddle books, and that's just what it's going to be. Are you famous? For that, I will tell the story of the only famous writer I've seen was once, I was in New York City, and Paul Newman was there. And Paul Newman really, in person, I never even recognize movie stars. Living in LA, you see them in ponytails and they don't look the same. But Paul Newman, really, people were dropping packages and turning their heads. It was really striking. And about 50 feet behind Paul Newman was an older male writer of sort of my parents' generation, whom I won't name because what I'm saying is not immensely flattering. But he was kind of, accepting the hubbub that the clamor that his presence occasioned. And then Paul Newman turned the corner and it all stopped. Who helped you get where you are? Well, I think that's an interesting question, because I think for every writer, I bet for each of the 5 of us who are speaking here today, each one of us could have a list of about 25 people. If it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a community to support a writer. It's kind of a lonely life. You go for years without knowing whether what you're doing will actually end up in a book. You hope that your work will give the kind of literary pleasure that you get from books. I mean, we're all here today because we do this very private thing. We read, and we do that by ourselves. But yet, here we are because we all love that. And it's that odd, kind of beautiful community built out of paradox that we rely on. We rely on people who buy our books, people who read our books. The stray letter from somebody who's read one of my books and for whom it's meant something makes my week. It's really a big thing. So, and from the person, that story about going to Berkeley, I eventually went to the director of financial aid, who had a hard time giving me any money because you're supposed to apply for financial aid. And I hadn't applied, and my mother was supposed to send her Social Security, and being, shaky, and she was suspicious of things like that, and didn't and wouldn't. But I had applied for a writing scholarship, and this man in his 50s at the time sort of opened this folder and read my stories and my poems that I'd submitted for this scholarship, and I can tell you now, they were bad. I mean, they were young girl watching the moon and not particularly fantastic in any realm, but he rubber stamped my application for 4 years, and there I was in college. So he was one of the first people who helped, and there have been people all the way along the line up into and including all of you. So that's what I have to say to Savannah at William Wirt. Whether or not she should become a writer, I don't know. I think what people would say is, if you can do what one of my teachers said is, if you can do anything else, do it. Not because it's so terrible, but because if you're going to be a writer, you really can't do anything else. And so much of literature is, when I was writing this love story, I noticed that so many of our great love stories were almost 2-1, written by either spinsters or people like Tolstoy and Proust who had terrible luck in love. And so much of literature is about lives, not that the writer lived, but that other people lived who were more in life than the writer. Virginia Woolf's, great To the Lighthouse. We remember Mrs. Ramsay, who's based on Virginia's mother, who had a full life with other people. Virginia didn't have that life. She couldn't have that life. She could only write about it. So in a funny way, that dichotomy exists too. Anyway, thank you.